My name is Marlys Dutton. I am 58 years old, and the joists under my own kitchen floor carried two sets of numbers. The first was a factory stamp, Sears lumber, cut and numbered in 1918. The second I recognized before I understood it, because I had written numbers in that exact shorthand for 34 years until the county board sat me down and told me a scanning contract could do my job cheaper. By September, I had $1,140 left in the world and a winning bid of $1,000 on a gutted Sears kit house. Nobody else wanted, condemned before I ever walked through the door. Beside every Sears stamp in blue lumber crayon was a second citation, 41 of them. Book and page, the exact way this county has recorded a redemption since before I was born, pointing straight at a vault, I had just been told. I no longer had any business standing behind. For 34 years, I was the Deputy Recorder of Deeds for Macoupin County, Illinois, working out of the $1 million courthouse on the square in Carlinville. I want that said plainly before anything else, because I did not lose that job for being bad at it. I lost it on the 9th of June in a meeting that took 11 minutes because the county board had signed a contract for $214,000 with a digitizing company out of Springfield. And the company needed the deed vault for 6 weeks. And I was told my position was being eliminated effective the following Friday with 6 weeks of severance pay. I had trained the 2 young men the company sent to run the scanners. I showed them how to lay the old books flat without cracking the spines. How to read a citation like Book 214, page 37, the way most people read a street address, faster than thinking. And I showed them, 3 separate times, where their machine was reading a smudged 8 as a 3 on the 1970s volumes, because the ink on those pages had gone the color of weak tea, and the software did not know the difference. Nobody thanked me for finding it. The county attorney told me it was outside the scope of my duties to flag vendor errors, which was the first time in 34 years anyone had told me that reading a page correctly was outside the scope of my duties. The meeting where they let me go happened upstairs in the boardroom, not in my own office, which I understood even then to be deliberate. The county administrator, a man named Phil Ecker, who had held the job 11 months, read from a letter he did not appear to have written and slid it across the table to me, still warm from the printer. He said, "The position of deputy recorder was being eliminated as part of the digitization transition. Not that I personally was being let go. A distinction he seemed to believe mattered to me. I asked him, since I was apparently the last person in the building who had actually opened the 1970s volumes, who was going to catch the next smudged 8 once I was gone? He said the vendor's own numbers showed a 98% accuracy rate, as though that settled it. I did the arithmetic anyway, out loud, because 34 years does not turn off on a Friday. 98% of roughly 200,000 pages left about 4,000 of them wrong, filed forever as though they were right. In a county where a mistaken book and page can cost a family a piece of ground their grandfather bought with cash. He told me that was outside the scope of the meeting. My husband Neil died 11 years ago at the kitchen table, fast, with his coffee still steaming, and I have lived alone since in the house on Prairie Street that we bought in 1988. My son Denny is in Peoria with a wife and 2 kids I see at Christmas if the roads are good. He did not call the week I lost my job, and I did not call him to tell him, which is its own kind of answer. There was one thing that June that I was grateful for, in a small and complicated way, and I want to put it down here because it matters later. In 2009, my father died of a stroke in a nursing home in Litchfield, and I spent the last 2 years of his life paying what Medicaid would not on a county clerk's salary until I did not have $40 to spare for anything. That was also the year the property taxes on the house where I grew up on Colfax Street in the part of town called Standard Edition simply stopped showing up as due. I assumed, the way you assume things you are too tired to check, that the county had written it off because the house was worthless and my father was dead, and there was no one left to collect from. I was grateful for that mercy for 16 years without once asking who had authorized it. By late September, I had gone through most of what 6 weeks of severance and what savings Neil and I had left. I was down to $1,140, and I was 58 years old, and I had spent 34 years reading other people's disasters off of paper without ever expecting to be one. That is when I found the listing. It came up on the servicer's site the way they all do. No photographs of the inside, 6 exterior shots taken from a car window, and a paragraph of disclosures written by a lawyer in Dallas who had never stood on the property. The house was at 118 Furnace Street, in Standard Edition, a neighborhood of about 156 identical mail-order houses that the Standard Oil Company had ordered from Sears, Roebuck and Company, in 1918 for the men who worked its coal mine outside town. And the model built at that address, like most of them in that neighborhood, was called the Carlin, which Sears had named for the town itself. The disclosure said the prior owner had held the home under a home equity conversion mortgage, what people call a reverse mortgage, originated in 2012, and that the loan had gone into default following the borrower's permanent removal from the property, and that the servicer was disposing of the remainder as is, where is, no representations of any kind. Interior condition unknown. Structural issues reported. Opening bid $1,000. I read that sentence about the reverse mortgage 3 times and did not think anything of it. A lot of old people take those loans out. I had recorded hundreds of them myself. I put in a bid of $1,118, which was $10 over what I told myself was my ceiling, and I watched the auction clock for 4 days, and nobody outbid me, because nobody wanted a gutted Sears kit house with a hole in the kitchen floor in a town that had already lost its Kmart, its Dairy Queen, and half its downtown storefronts. I won at the opening bid of $1,000. Closing costs, county transfer stamp, and the recording fee for my own deed came to $112. That left me $28 in my checking account, and a house I had never set foot inside. I drove out to Furnace Street on the 3rd of October, in my barn coat with the torn cuff I keep meaning to replace, my hair pulled back in the braid I have worn every working day since 1994, and a key that the servicer had mailed to a lockbox, because there was no lock left on the actual door. There was a notice zip tied to the porch rail, orange and laminated, from the City of Carlinville, Department of Building and zoning. It said the structure had been found unsafe on the 4th of August, that repairs to the kitchen floor system were required within 90 days, and that failure to comply would result in a fine of $250 per day. 90 days from the 4th of August put the deadline on the 2nd of November. I stood on the porch and did the arithmetic in my head, the way I have done arithmetic in my head my whole working life, and I had 30 days left before I even walked through the door. The inside was exactly what the disclosure had promised, and worse than I had let myself picture. Every wall in the front 2 rooms was stripped to bare studs. The plaster and lath pulled and stacked in a dumpster somebody had never paid to have hauled. In the kitchen, the subfloor was gone in a ragged circle 4 feet across, down to the joists. And past the joists I could see the dirt of the crawl space and a pipe that had been sawn off clean where the copper used to run. Somebody had started a flip in 2021, gotten that far, and walked away. And the house had sat open to the weather for 4 years since. I stood in the front room a while before I made myself go further, the way a person stands in a doorway before diving into cold water. The floor plan was the same one I had walked past in 100 other standard addition houses without ever really registering it. A narrow center hall, a front parlor to the left, a dining room behind it, a kitchen at the back, with a door out to what had once been a small covered stoop.
Somebody long before the flip had screwed a chair rail straight into what I would later learn were 107-year-old studs, painted white, entirely wrong for the house.
And I remember standing under it, thinking that a house does not know it has been abandoned. It just keeps standing the way it was built to stand, waiting for somebody to walk back in. I went through the whole downstairs first, boots loud on bare subfloor, my breath showing even though it was only the 3rd of October, because a house with no interior walls does not hold heat any better than the yard does. Upstairs, both bedrooms still had their original wood floors, scarred but sound.
And a closet in the back bedroom still had a child's height marks penciled straight onto the door frame. 4 of them, dated 1949 through 1952.
Next to the initials L.O. I did not know yet whose initials those were. I got down on my knees at the edge of that hole with a flashlight. Because that is what you do when you are the kind of person who has spent her whole life needing to see the bottom of a page before she believes what is written on it. And I looked at the exposed floor joists running under the kitchen. Every one of them, every single joist, had a stamp burned into the wood, a part number, and a letter code, the way Sears used to mark every stick of lumber it shipped. So a crew of 2 men with a numbered instruction book could raise a whole house from a rail car of parts in a matter of weeks. I had read about the standard edition houses my whole life without ever really looking at the framing of one. I ran my thumb over a stamp that read something like R4C 118, and I understood, the way you understand a thing you already half knew, that I was kneeling in a house built exactly the way the catalog said it would be built, joist by numbered joist, in 1918, for a man who worked the coal mine and never once had to guess where a board went. I went home that first night with 30 days on the clock and no plan except to sleep on it, and I did not sleep. Around midnight, I got up, found the headlamp Neil used to wear roofing the garage, still in his toolbox in the mudroom, put 4 new batteries in it out of my $28 and drove back out to Furnace Street with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil, because a legal pad and a mechanical pencil are what I have carried into every unfamiliar record my whole life. I got down on the kitchen floor a second time, and with the headlamp close to the wood, I saw what I had missed by flashlight the day before. Beside every Sears stamp, close enough that whoever wrote it had meant it to be read with the stamp, was a second mark. Not burned in, not stamped. Written in blue lumber crayon, the kind carpenters carry in their bib pockets, gone waxy and pale with age but still legible if you got your face down, close to the joist. The first one I found said, Book 19, page 203, 1932. The chalk, or the crayon, whatever it was, looked older than the ones near it, softer at the edges. The numerals formed in a rounder hand. I copied it onto the legal pad and moved down the joist. The next one said Book 214, page 37, 1979. Then Book 221, page 114, 1981. Then 2 together on the same joist, 6 inches apart, Book 230, page 9, 1984, and Book 231, page 266, 1985. The second night was the hard one. 9 feet of joist were readable from the edge of the hole without much trouble. Kneeling with my forearms braced on the subfloor, but the framing ran on past that in both directions under sound floor I could not see through. So I lowered myself down through the same hole into the crawl space itself and went the rest of the house on my back and my elbows. It was maybe 3 feet of clearance from the dirt to the underside of the floor, cold enough that my breath hung in the beam of the headlamp, spiderwebs breaking across my face every few feet, and I held the light in my teeth so both hands stayed free, one braced flat against a joist and the other holding the mechanical pencil steady, while I copied a citation upside down and backward. My knees found every rock in that dirt. Twice I lost my place in the dark and had to back out into the kitchen hole just to check I had not copied the same joist twice. Somewhere under that floor I did the other arithmetic too, the one that had nothing to do with the joists. The vendor's contract still had the vault upstairs at the courthouse scheduled for final verification before Christmas, the original books queued behind it, to be pulped once that verification cleared. And every hour I spent flat on my back in that dirt was an hour I was not spending figuring out how to stop it. I put it aside and kept copying, because a person can only fight one clock at a time. I backed myself out for good a little after 2 in the morning with 30 more lines on the pad, gone soft and curled at the corners from my own hands. And it was closer to 3 before I had the truck heater running hard enough to feel my fingers again. I crawled that kitchen floor and the crawl space beneath it for 2 nights running. And by the time I was done, I had 41 lines on my legal pad, each one a book number, a page number, and a year, running from that first strange one in 1932 up through a last entry dated 2019. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I had written citations in that format for 34 years. Book and page is how Macoupin County has recorded every deed, every mortgage, every release since before I was born, and whoever had crawled under this kitchen floor with a crayon had used the same shorthand I used at my own desk for over 3 decades, not because it was pretty, but because it was fast. And because once you have written 10,000 of them, you cannot write a citation any other way. 40 of the 41 fell into a clean pattern once I laid the pad flat under the kitchen light and looked at the years in order. Book numbers climbing steadily from the low 200s up past 300. Years running 1979 to 2019. 4 decades of entries in a hand that never wavered even as it aged. The first one, Book 19, page 203, 1932, sat outside all of it. Wrong decade, wrong volume series entirely. A book number so low it belonged to an era before the county even used the numbering system. The other 40 entries followed. I circled it twice on the pad and could not tell you, that second night, what it meant. I only knew it did not belong with the rest, and that whoever had written it first, closest to the closet under the stairs, as if the other 40 had grown outward from it over the following 47 years. I still had a courthouse key card that had not been deactivated, which tells you something about how a county operates, but I did not use it. I walked in the front doors on a Tuesday morning like anyone else, past the metal detector I used to walk around, and asked at the counter. The counter I had worked behind for 34 years to see the deed and lien books for the years I needed. The woman working my old desk was 26 and had been on the job 4 months. She did not recognize me, which was fair, because I had trained her replacement's replacement, not her. I told her I was a member of the public researching a property I owned. She said that was fine. It took me most of a day, going book by book, page by page, 40 citations at a time, but by 4 o'clock, I had it laid out on a legal pad in my own handwriting, the same handwriting from the Joists translated into a table. 40 of the 41 citations were tax sale redemptions, standard edition addresses, one after another: Colfax Street, Loomis Street, 3rd Street, Furnace Street. Running from 1979 to 2019, every single one of them paid in full by an entity called Carlin Land Trust No. 3. Not a person. A land trust, the kind of instrument Illinois allows where the county records show only a trustee bank, and the actual owner, the beneficiary, is a name kept private in a file the trustee holds and nobody else can open. The 41st citation, Book 19, page 203, was not a redemption at all. It was a tax sale. The county had sold a property out from under its owner in 1932 for delinquent taxes to a buyer whose address on the record was Springfield, Illinois. I wrote down the parcel description because I did not yet understand why it mattered, and because not understanding a citation has never once stopped me from copying it exactly. The trustee of record on all 40 redemptions was a bank still standing on the same square I had just walked across. Farmers State Bank, in the same brick building it had occupied since before Neil and I were married. Marble sills and brass teller cages downstairs unchanged since we opened our first joint account there in 1988, with a trust department on the 2nd floor, newer, carpeted, quiet, the particular way rooms handling other people's money tend to be quiet, that I had recorded documents from my whole career without ever once climbing those stairs myself. I climbed them the next morning, in the good slacks I keep for funerals and county board meetings, my hair pinned instead of braided,
because I have learned that people listen differently to a woman who looks like she dressed for the appointment. The trust officer was a younger woman named Renee Sackett.
Careful and not unkind, with an office window that looked straight down onto the courthouse dome, close enough that on a clear day you could watch the flag on top of it move. She told me that Carlin Land Trust Number 3 was governed by an instrument dated 1979, and that under its terms the file could be opened only to the person the instrument named as successor beneficiary, and that the instrument defined that person in a way she had never once, in 11 years at that desk, seen triggered. She told me, before she pulled anything, that Illinois land trusts exist specifically so a piece of property can be managed without the public ever learning who benefits from it. A privacy the legislature built in on purpose, and that in those 11 years she had processed exactly 2 prior requests to access a Carlin Trust file, both rejected because the person asking could not prove they were the named beneficiary, she said. She had privately begun to assume the file would simply sit in that drawer until somebody finally cleaned it out after she retired. She turned her monitor so I could read it myself. The successor beneficiary, the document said, is the record owner of the Carlin at 118 Furnace Street, Carlinville, Illinois. Whoever that person may be at any given time, upon presentation of a recorded deed in that person's name. I had a recorded deed in my name. It had cost me $1,112 and left me $28. Mrs. Sackett unlocked a drawer and lifted out a file box, gray, unlabeled except for a strip of masking tape that said Carlin Number 3 in the same round. Aging hand, I had spent 2 nights copying off a kitchen floor. Inside were 41 envelopes, sealed, each one with a name and a street address typed on the front in an old manual typewriter's uneven strike. She told me the instrument required that they be delivered by hand, by the successor beneficiary, to the named recipient or their heirs, and that nothing in the file could be photocopied, mailed, or opened by the bank itself. It had been sitting in that drawer, she said, for 6 years, since the last entry was added, waiting for someone to walk in and prove they owned that address. I sat in a bank trust department with a box of 41 sealed envelopes on the table in front of me and $28 in my checking account and 30 days, now down to 26, before the county started charging me $250 for every one of them. I could not afford gas to deliver 41 envelopes across a neighborhood I would have to drive back and forth to a dozen times, so I called Deese Title on the square, where a man named Roger Deese had bought me coffee more than once when I still had a desk to buy me coffee at, and asked if he had 2 days of filing he could pay cash for. He gave me $40 a day, indexing a backlog of easements nobody else wanted to sort. It was not a living. It bought gas, and some weeks not much else. So I ate down the pantry I had stocked before the layoff, cans of things I had been meaning to use up for a year, and skipped supper more than once, and called it not being hungry. I started with the envelope marked Blakeman, 246 Colfax Street, partly because I still had the muscle memory of a filing system, and Colfax came early in my head, and partly because I remembered a Blakeman name from somewhere in my own childhood on that same street. Ivy Blakeman was 74, small, with a garden still going strong in October and a porch swing that needed oiling. She read the front of the envelope twice before she let me hand it to her, and when she opened it, she went very still. Inside was a photocopy of a 1996 redemption receipt in her late husband Walter's name, the taxes on their Carlin, paid in full to Macoupin County by Carlin Land Trust Number 3. And underneath it, in that same round aging hand, one line. Walter never had to know. Neither did she, until he'd already spent the worry. I want to write down what Ivy said, because it was the first time I heard the town's whole story out loud, the story everybody agreed on. She said her husband had gone to his grave, believing the county had simply forgiven the debt. Believed the county forgave a lot in the 80s, when the mine cut back and half of Standard Edition went underwater on its taxes at once, she said. The man everyone credited, if they credited anyone, was the county itself, a kind of faceless mercy nobody thought to question. And she said, unprompted, that she remembered a man named Laverne Ostrowski standing on the sidewalk in front of her house every October. For as long as she could recall, with a little box camera, never once coming up the walk, never once explaining himself, until eventually the neighborhood just decided he was odd and let him be. I had known that name my whole life without knowing it belonged to anyone. Laverne Ostrowski had mopped the courthouse floors for 44 years, from 1961 until he retired in 2005. I started as deputy recorder in 1991, so our 14 years overlapped entirely, and we had nodded to each other in that hallway most mornings for all 14 of them. He emptied my trash can. I signed his time card twice a month when the regular supervisor was out. I could not, sitting on Ivy Blakeman's porch, have told you a single thing about him beyond the fact that he wore the same gray work coat every day of every winter, and that the courthouse smelled like pine cleaner an hour after he left each night. Ivy told me the town's other story about him, too, the one that had hardened into fact over the years, the way stories do when nobody corrects them. That he had been a cheap old bachelor who lived alone in a falling-down house on Furnace Street, took out a reverse mortgage in his 80s that nobody could account for, and let the place rot around him instead of fixing it. Evidence, people said, that money did not always buy sense. She told me this, looking a little ashamed, because by then she had an envelope in her lap that made the story sound like something else entirely, and she was quick enough to see it. I delivered 9 more envelopes that first week, Walking Colfax, and then Loomis in the good boots I had resoled twice rather than replace. My barn coat traded for the wool. One Neil bought me the last Christmas he was alive, because October in Standard Edition runs colder than the square. A man named Purcell on Loomis Street cried at his own kitchen table over a receipt from 2003. A woman named Dolores Fenn, citation number 6 on my legal pad, told me her mother had always suspected something and had never been able to prove it, and had died still not knowing, and asked if she could keep the envelope on her mother's dresser instead of framing it. I said that was hers to decide. It was the kind of thing I found myself saying a lot that October, that a thing was theirs to decide. Because for 34 years, my job had been telling people what a document meant, and I had never once had to tell anyone what to do about it. Not every door opened the way Ivy's had, whose own envelope, I should say plainly, was citation number 19 on my legal pad, her husband Walter's redemption, dated 1996. At a house on 3rd Street, I delivered an envelope to a man named Gerald Aldridge, who read the receipt inside, folded it back along its original crease, and told me flatly that he did not believe a word of it, that Sears houses did not get saved by janitors, and that he intended to call the state's attorney about whoever was running some kind of scheme on old people. I told him he was welcome to call the state's attorney, and that I had photographs of the original vault documents on my phone if he wanted to see them first. And I gave him my number, which nobody had asked me to do, and which I did anyway, because I had spent 34 years being the person people called when they did not believe the record.
He called 2 days later to apologize. He never did call the state's attorney.
At a house on Loomis Street, a woman named Carol Titsworth answered the door in a housecoat at 2 in the afternoon and would not let me pass the storm door until I had shown her 3 forms of identification, which I understood because I would have done the same. When she finally read what was in the envelope, she sat down on her own front step in October in a housecoat and did not get up for a long while. Her mother, she told me once she could talk again, had raised 4 children alone on a hairdresser's income after her husband left in 1988 and had always told the children the house stayed in the family because of a miracle. And Carol had always taken that to mean faith or luck or the general kindness of God rather than one specific man with a crayon and a box camera. On Furnace Street itself, 6 doors up from my own, an old man named Elmer Kobler took the envelope from me on his porch without inviting me in, the way some men that age receive everything and read it standing up, working a thumbnail under the flap. First, the way a person opens a bill they expect to be bad news. When he got to the handwritten line under the receipt, he stopped moving altogether. Envelope in one hand, storm door still propped against his shoulder with the other, and it was a long moment before he said anything at all. I always wondered why the county never came after us. In '86, he said, and folded the envelope back along its crease and put it in his shirt pocket and thanked me. And that was the whole conversation. A house on 3rd Street belonged now to a woman named Rhonda Spear, who had inherited it from her mother 2 years before and still kept her mother's rosary looped over a nail by the door. She read the envelope standing right there in the doorway, the rosary swinging behind her shoulder, and her hands were not steady doing it, the paper shaking enough that I could hear it. "Mama always said somebody was watching out for us," she said, and did not explain any further, and I did not ask her to. I found one house on Colfax 2 doors down from Ivy, where nobody answered at all, 3 separate afternoons running, the mailbox stacking up. I learned around the neighborhood that the woman who had lived there, June Restivo, had died the previous winter with no children and a nephew somewhere in Arizona who had not yet come to settle the estate. I could not deliver that envelope by hand to anyone, since the instrument required a living recipient or a known heir, and I did not know how to find one from a front porch in standard edition. I left it with Mrs. Sackett instead, with a note explaining why, and as far as I know, it is still in that drawer, the only one of the 41 that never reached where it was going. Ivy walked with me on 3 of those afternoons, not because I asked her to, but because, she said, she had lived on that street since 1974, and knew who still answered a knock, and who had gone deaf, and who had moved to Litchfield to be near their children, and because, she told me once, sitting in my truck between stops. She had nothing else in October worth doing that mattered as much as this did. She told me about the mine cutbacks in the 80s, about the year half of standard edition fell behind on taxes at once because the company laid off 2 shifts in a single month, about how her own Walter had worked that mine 31 years and never once mentioned coming within a signature of losing the house they had raised 3 children in. She told me Laverne used to come into the hardware store on the square every few weeks and buy exactly one thing: a box of nails, a hinge, a can of the same brown paint, never more than he needed for whatever small repair he was making that week, and that the owner used to joke that Laverne Ostrowski was the only man in Carlinville who bought hardware like he expected to live forever and spent like he expected to die broke. Somewhere in those first 2 weeks, I stopped thinking of the list as a task and started thinking of it the way I used to think of a deed book, a record that exists whether or not anyone reads it, except that this one, unlike a deed book, had never once been opened, not by the county, not by the town, not by a single one of the 41 families, until a woman with $28 and a borrowed headlamp came crawling under her own kitchen floor. Within 2 weeks, I had delivered 31 of the 41 envelopes, and I had started keeping a running tally of the redemption amounts on the back of my legal pad, the way you cannot help doing when you have spent your career adding columns that are supposed to foot. Individually, the numbers were almost modest: $600 here, $1,100 there. A property in 1994 that had run all the way to $2,300 before Laverne caught it. But 40 entries deep, the total climbed past $60,000, and by the time I had all 40 figures in front of me, cross-checked against the vault records I had photographed on my phone, the sum came to $71,400, paid out in pieces across 40 years by a man whose entire working life, by my own signature on his time cards, had never paid him more than the low 30s a year, even at the end, on a pension besides that. I could not make that arithmetic work honestly until I looked at the dates again and saw what should have been obvious. The redemptions before 2012 were small and spaced out. A house every year or two, the kind of sum a careful bachelor with a paid-off house and no family to spend on could set aside out of a custodian's wage, and after 2005 his pension besides, if he never once bought anything he did not need. But 7 of the 41, all of them dated 2012 or later, ran larger, some of them the largest on the whole list, clustered close together in a way the earlier ones never had been. I already knew from the disclosure I had read back in September without understanding it, that the previous owner of 118 Furnace Street had taken out a reverse mortgage in 2012. I had assumed, the way the whole town had apparently assumed, that it belonged to some stranger who had let a house rot for no reason anyone could name. It belonged to Laverne. The house he had taken out that loan against, the house whose value he had spent down to fund the last 7 years of somebody else's mercy, was the same house I had bought at auction for $1,000. The same house whose kitchen floor was going to cost me $250 a day if I did not fix it inside of 3 weeks. The town had a name for a man who took a loan against his own house and let it fall apart. Cheap. Foolish. Nothing left to show for it. I stood in Ivy Blakeman's kitchen with that number, $71,400, written on the back of a legal pad, and understood that the town had been exactly right about the facts and had gotten every last thing about the meaning backward. I still had 10 envelopes left to deliver and 14 days on the county's clock, and I still had to figure out how a woman with $28 was going to rebuild a kitchen floor. So I went back to Furnace Street, most evenings after the porches, in my work gloves and the headlamp to measure the joists and price lumber I could not yet buy. It was on one of those evenings, moving a stack of warped paneling out of the front hall to get a clean look at the stairs, that I found the closet. It was built under the stair run, the kind of shallow triangular space every one of those houses has, and somebody had hung a hollow core door over the opening at some point after 1918, cheap and out of place against the original trim. The flippers had never touched it. Inside, on a shelf bracketed into the studs at chest height, sat a projector, black enamel gone dull with dust, the brand name Bell & Howell stamped in chrome across the front, aimed dead level at the closet's own back wall, which somebody had painted flat white sometime long before the rest of the house went to plaster and lath. Below the shelf, on the floor, was a coffee can, the old red and yellow Folgers kind, filled with reels of film, each one in a cardboard sleeve, with a year written on it in the same round hand I now knew from the Joists, and underneath the reels, wrapped in a shop rag, a spare projector bulb still in its original box. 1979, 1980, 1981, straight through, with a few gaps, to 2019. I did not have electricity turned on in that house yet, so I ran an extension cord from my truck battery through a jump box I bought, used for $30 I did not have, and I plugged that projector in, not knowing if 40-year-old bulbs and 40-year-old film would do anything at all besides smoke. The bulb held. And it was only later, turning the shop rag over in my hands, that I understood Laverne had kept a spare on hand the whole time, the way a man does who has already learned once that a single point of failure can cost you everything. I threaded the earliest reel the way Neil taught me to thread a movie projector at the volunteer fire hall 30 years ago, and I turned it on and aimed it at the closet's own painted wall, because that is where it had always been aimed, and I sat down on an overturned bucket in my own gutted front hall to watch.
The 1979 reel showed a street. Colfax, then Loomis, then Furnace itself, filmed from the sidewalk in the flat gray light of an Illinois October morning.
House after house, a slow pan held on each front porch for maybe 4 seconds before the camera moved on. 41 houses, filmed in order, silent, no faces, no one entering or leaving a frame, just the fronts of houses that I now understood he had redeemed or was about to redeem, recorded the way a man records something he cannot say out loud and does not trust himself to forget. I watched 1985. Same houses, same order, the trees taller, a car parked in a driveway that had been empty 6 years before. I watched 1994, 2001, 2008. Each reel 4 or 5 minutes of the same 41 fronts, the film stock going warmer and then colder as the decades, and the film companies changed, but the pattern never changing at all. Every October, the same route, the same houses, filmed from the same sidewalk distance. Never once did the camera come up a single walk. or catch a single face in a window. Some years told their own small stories if a person watched close enough. In the 1991 reel, a for sale sign stood in the yard at 84 Loomis for 4 seconds of film, and was gone by the 1992 reel. And I never did learn whether Lavern's money was the reason it came down or whether the family simply found a buyer on their own, because not every rescue in that coffee can turn out to be written down anywhere else I could check. In 2003, a house on Furnace Street, 2 doors, from the one I now owned, had a wheelchair ramp built into the frame that had not been there the reel before, and it stayed in every reel after. In 2012, the year of the reverse mortgage, the film stock itself changed, cheaper, grainier. The kind of drugstore process film a man buys once he has started paying closer attention to what things cost. The houses kept appearing in the same order regardless. The way a rosary gets said the same way every year, no matter what else has changed in the hand holding it. I ran 12 reels that first night before the jump box finally gave out and left me sitting in the dark with the smell of hot dust from the projector bulb still in the air. I went back the next evening, and the one after that, working through the coffee can in order, keeping a fresh page on the legal pad for what I started calling, only to myself, the roll call, a tally of which houses appeared, which years, which ones dropped out of the rotation entirely partway through, because a family had finally moved on or a house had finally come down, and there was nothing left on the lot to film. 2 houses left the roll, called that way, over 40 years. 39 others never did. By the 9th reel, I understood I was watching an accounting, not of what he had spent, of what he had kept safe. 41 houses standing, families staying put, year after year, filmed the way another man might have kept a ledger, except that a ledger can be audited, and this could only be watched. The last reel in the can was marked 2019, and it ran longer than the others, past the usual 4 minutes into something closer to 9. It opened the same way, Colfax, Loomis, Furnace, the familiar fronts. But partway through, the camera stopped moving down a street and instead climbed the courthouse steps at night. The rotunda lit only by the exit signs and 1 bulb over the recorder of deeds counter, my old counter, and Laverne Ostrowski stepped into the frame. He was old already by 2019-83, thinner than I remembered him from the hallway, in the same gray work coat he had worn my entire career, and he stood in the middle of that rotunda floor. Under the dome I had walked beneath 10,000 times, and he talked to the camera the way a man talks when he has decided this is the only time he is going to say a thing out loud. He said the names of a few houses, addresses I recognized from my own legal pad, and then he said that there was one more, a 42nd one, that he had never written down anywhere because it did not belong on a joist with the others. He said the year was 2009, and he said an address on Colfax Street. And my whole body went cold in that hallway before my mind had caught up with what my ears had heard, because the address he said, standing under that dome at 83 years old, talking to a camera he must have known only he would ever see, was 167 Colfax Street. The house I grew up in. The house where my father died. The taxes I had spent 16 years believing the county had simply, mercifully, written off. I let that reel run out to the end of the film and slap against the take-up spool for a long time before I got up off the bucket and turned the projector off. I did not cry, not that night. I have never been a woman who cries in the moment a thing happens. I sat in the dark of my own front hall with my knees drawn up and did the same thing I have always done with a piece of information too large to hold all at once, which is break it into smaller pieces and check them one at a time. The piece I could check was the citation that had never fit, the one still circled twice on my legal pad from the first night with the headlamp. Book 19, page 203, 1932. I went back to the courthouse the next morning, still on the public side of the counter, and asked the same young woman for the 1932 tax sale record, and this time for the deed index for that same year, and for anything the county held on the chain of title for 118 Furnace Street, going back to its original 1918 purchase. The tax sale book told me what I had already half guessed sitting in the dark. In October of 1932, at the height of the Depression, Macoupin County sold the property at 118 Furnace Street for delinquent taxes, $41 owed, to a buyer of record in Springfield, Illinois.
The deed index told me the original 1918 purchaser of that same lot, the man who had ordered a Sears Carlin from a catalog and put it up board by numbered board,
was named Anton Ostrowski, a laborer at the coal mine, and that a lease was recorded the following spring, 1933, in which the Springfield buyer rented the house back to the Ostrowski family monthly for 11 years. In 1943, a warranty deed conveyed the property back to Frank Ostrowski, Anton's son, for a sum the record listed as $1 and other good and valuable consideration. The standard phrase county recorders use when nobody wants the real number written down. None of that came easily out of a single afternoon in the vault, and I want to say that honestly. The 1932 volumes are kept in a separate cage from the modern ones, unheated, because nobody digitizes what nobody requests, and I spent 2 afternoons in my coat and gloves turning pages that had not been opened, by the dust along their edges, in decades. The tax sale entry itself was 4 lines in a clerk's careful hand, a parcel number, a delinquency amount, a buyer's name and city, nothing more. The same flat bureaucratic language that had recorded 10,000 ordinary transactions, and happened, in this one case, to have also recorded the worst year of a family's life. I had to cross the parcel number against a 1918 plat map to confirm. It was the same lot at 118 Furnace Street, because the addresses in that neighborhood had been renumbered once, in the 1950s, and the county had never gone back and cleaned up every old cross-reference, which is exactly the kind of small clerical carelessness I had spent 34 years trying to prevent, and had apparently, in this one instance 40 years before I was born, failed to prevent. I took what I had to Ivy Blakeman because by then I had learned that Ivy remembered things about that neighborhood that had never made it into any book I could pull. She told me what she had heard growing up 2 doors from the Ostrowskis, which was that Anton Ostrowski's grandson, the boy everyone later knew as the courthouse custodian, had been born in 1936. Into a house his own family did not legally own, and had spent the first 7 years of his life watching his father hand over rent every month to a landlord in Springfield who had bought their own home out from under them for the price of a bad year, she said. The family never spoke of it again. Once they got the house back in 1943, the way people in that generation did not speak of the things that had frightened them the worst. I told her then about the pencil marks on the back bedroom door frame. L.O. 4 dates running 1949 through 1952. And she laughed, not unkindly, and said of course that was him. 7 years old when the house finally came back to his family, and 16, the last time anybody stood him against that frame with a ruler. She said she had always wondered, without ever quite putting it into words, why Laverne Ostrowski had spent his whole life the way he had, and that, sitting on her porch with an envelope in her lap, she finally thought she understood it. He had grown up watching a family lose a house to $41 they could not raise fast enough, and he had spent 40 years making sure it never happened to anyone else on that street again, if he could help it, and if it cost him every dollar he had. I want to say plainly what that left me holding, because the arithmetic of it is the reason I made the choice I made next. I now owned, by operation of the successor beneficiary clause in a 46-year-old trust instrument, standing in the shoes of a man who had never once filed a claim in his life, 41 enforceable, entirely unrecorded redemption debts against 41 families in standard edition. Illinois law does not forgive a redemption because the person who paid it chose not to collect. It sits on the record, accruing statutory interest, until somebody either collects it or releases it. Laverne Ostrowski had never recorded a single release. He had paid 41 debts and left every one of them standing on the books as if they were still owed, which meant that under the law, if I did nothing, or if I did the thing the law would actually have entitled me to do, I could walk into that same trust department and collect $71,400 plus 4 decades of interest from 40 families who believed, every one of them, that the county had simply forgiven them, and from my own family's estate, besides, since the 41st beneficiary of that unrecorded kindness was me. I let myself imagine that other version for exactly as long as it took to be ashamed of imagining it. $71,400 would have cleared what was left of Neil's and my medical debt from his last year, would have fixed the roof on the house on Prairie Street that I had been patching with tar for 3 winters, would have meant I never again had to do arithmetic on whether I could afford both groceries and gas in the same week. All I would have had to do was mail 40 letters on county letterhead. I no longer had any right to use, citing a statute I could still recite from memory, to 40 families who had already told me, standing on their own porches, that they believed they had been forgiven. I thought about Carol Titsworth, sitting down on her own front step. I thought about Dolores Finn's mother's dresser. I could not make myself write those letters, and I want to be honest that the reason was not entirely noble. Part of it was that I did not think I could go on living in this town, on this street, in this house, having done it, but most of it, and I have turned this over enough times now to trust the answer, was that I had spent 34 years being the person who kept the record straight, and there is a difference between a record and a weapon, and I was not going to be the one who finally turned this particular record into one. The D's title money was already gone to gas and batteries, and the jump box, $31 to my name again. And I had a condemned kitchen and 11 days left on the county's clock. And I sat with that fact for exactly one evening. Before I understood, there was no decision to make, only a cost to figure out how to pay. I was not going to collect on Laverne Ostrowski's kindness. I was going to close it out the way it should have been closed out 46 years ago, one recorded release at a time, so that not one of those 41 families ever spent another year not knowing whether the county could still come after them. A release of redemption runs $41 a page at the recorder's office. My old counter, the same fee schedule I had posted on the wall myself in 2003. 41 releases came to $1,681, which I did not have and had no way to earn in 11 days on 3 days a week of cash filing at D's title. I told Ivy Blakeman the number, sitting at her kitchen table with my legal pad between us, not asking her for anything, just saying it out loud, because I needed to say it to a person and not to a wall. She got up without a word, went to the drawer where she kept her checkbook, and wrote a check for $1,681, made out to the Macoupin County Recorder of Deeds, and slid it across the table before I could tell her not to. I asked her what she wanted for collateral. She said she did not want anything for collateral, because a woman who had just spent 3 weeks handing strangers proof that a dead man had quietly carried them for 40 years was not a woman she needed to secure a loan against. She said it, like it was the simplest fact in the world. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else that happened, that fall. I walked into the Recorder of Deeds office the next morning in the good slacks again, my hair pinned, and stood at the counter I had worked behind for 34 years, on the other side of it this time, and filed 41 releases of redemption, one for each family, each one bearing the legal description of a house on Colfax or Loomis or 3rd or Furnace Street, and the last one bearing the legal description of 167 Colfax Street, in the name of the estate of my own father. The clerk who took my check, the same 26-year-old who had not recognized me 3 weeks earlier, asked if I wanted a receipt. I told her I did. I have it still. That left me 10 days to solve a kitchen floor, no money at all, and a hole 4 feet across down to the joists
In a house the city had every legal right to fine me $250 a day for not fixing.
Word travels differently in a neighborhood you have just walked door to door for 3 weeks, handing out proof of 40 years of quiet mercy.
I had not asked anyone for help with the floor. I had not mentioned the floor to a single person on Colfax or Loomis because I did not see how it was anyone's business, but mine and the city's. But Ivy Blakeman apparently mentioned it to somebody, and that somebody mentioned it to somebody else. And on the Saturday morning, 9 days before my hearing,
I came out onto the porch at 118 Furnace Street to find 4 pickup trucks parked along the curb and 6 men standing in my front yard with tool belts.
3 of them retired from trades I recognized off the top of my legal pad. A carpenter named Purcell, whose grandfather's redemption I had delivered on Loomis Street. An electrician named Volker, whose mother had cried at her own kitchen table over a receipt from 2003, and a man everyone called Snapper, who had done nothing but roof houses in that neighborhood for 40 years and wanted. He told me, "No pay and no thanks and no speeches, just a level and a chalk line." I told them I could not pay them. Purcell said nobody had asked me to, he said. His grandfather had a mortgage paid off by a man who mopped floors for a living, and never once said a word about it, and that the least a Purcell could do, 50 years on, was give a Saturday. I made coffee in a pot run off the truck battery again, because the house still had no power of its own, and carried it out to the yard in a stack of paper cups from the Casey's on the highway. And for a few hours that Saturday, my gutted kitchen sounded the way I imagine it must have sounded in 1918, when two men with a numbered instruction book raised the whole frame in a matter of weeks. Volker ran a temporary line off a generator in his truck bed to power the saws. Purcell's grandson, 16, and pressed into service, spent the morning pulling nails out of salvaged lath so the wood could be reused elsewhere, and complained about it exactly as much as a 16-year-old should. Snapper did not say more than 40 words the whole day, and every one of them was a measurement. The joists themselves were the harder problem. Building code in Carlinville requires floor framing to match the structural grade of the original system, or better, and a modern 2x10 off a lumberyard shelf. Volker told me, does not carry the same load path as a true dimension joist milled to Sears specification in 1918. Not without an engineer's letter I could not afford either. It was Snapper who remembered that a Carlin out past Girard, 12 miles east, had been torn down that spring after a barn fire took the roof, and that the salvage yard that hauled the lumber away still had the joists stacked behind its office, every one of them stamped the same way mine were, because Sears had shipped every Carlin in that whole company order off the same set of mill plans. Purcell drove out that same afternoon. The salvage yard turned out to be run by a man who had known Laverne only as a customer, decades back, when Laverne used to ride the bus out twice a year to buy cull lumber cheap for whatever house he was quietly fixing that season, though the man had never once understood why an old courthouse custodian needed so much lumber for somebody who supposedly could not keep his own roof from leaking. When Purcell explained what the joists were actually for, the man would not take payment at all, loaded 11 of them into the truck bed himself, and said, only that it sounded like the old man's business had finally come due. Purcell backed the truck up to the porch around 4 that afternoon, and we carried the joists in 2 at a time, Snapper on the other end of each one, and laid them out across the yard on a pair of sawhorses to sort before anybody made a cut. Every one of them had its own Sears stamp burned into the end grain, the same as mine, and Volker took a construction crayon of his own, orange instead of blue, and went down the row marking which stamp matched which gap in my kitchen framing, because a Girard joist was not interchangeable with just any span. It had to carry the same load rating as the section it was replacing, or Kerner would fail it on site. 2 of the 11 ran a foot short and got set aside for scrap. 9 days now stood between me and Kerner's hearing, and the fine clock was ticking in the back of my head the whole time at $250 a day. I did not have. So when Volker said the other 9 matched close enough, I did not ask him twice. He only had to trim an inch or so off either end, and we carried them in 1 at a time and set them into the joist pockets. stamp facing up the same as all the rest. Snapper had brought a stack of 3/4-inch plywood and 2 boxes of ring shank nails in the bed of his own truck, the way he told me. Afterward, he brought supplies to every job, whether the owner could pay for them or not, and his crew nailed the plywood subfloor down over the new joists, in a pattern he chalked out himself, 6 inches on the edges and 8 in the field, checking his own lines twice before he let anyone near them with a nail gun. I spent the last odd hour on my own knees, driving ring shank nails. Volker handed me one at a time, counting them out loud without meaning to, the way I count anything. And by 4 that afternoon, the whole kitchen floor rang solid under my boots for the first time since I had bought the place. By Sunday's evening, 6 men, who had never met each other before that Saturday, had my kitchen floor framed, sistered, and sheathed. Another dead man's numbered lumber fitted straight into the gap in my own. Kerner was not an unfair man, and I want that on the record, because it would be easy to tell this story as though someone had been out to get me, and nobody was. He had condemned that floor because it was, in August, genuinely unsafe, a hole a child could fall through, and his job was to make sure it got fixed, not to make sure I suffered for the fixing. He came alone, in county coveralls, with a flashlight of his own clipped to his belt, and got down on his knees at the edge of the new subfloor, the same way I had once knelt at the edge of the old hole, working a probe into 3 different joists to check for give. He counted the fastener spacing along one run half under his breath, the way a man checks his own arithmetic. 16 inches on center, same as it ought to be, he said, mostly to himself, and made a note on his clipboard. Then he stood up, looked at the stamped end grain sticking out past the new subfloor edge, and asked where the lumber had come from. I told him Gerard, he said. That explained why it matched so well, checked the fastener pattern against his codebook once more, and signed the release on the spot, 3 days ahead of his own deadline. He told me it was the best repair he had signed off on all year, and that whoever had sourced matching period lumber, instead of just meeting code with new material, had done more than the ordinance required. I told him I had 6 men in standard edition to thank for that, and he said that did not surprise him one bit, not in that neighborhood. That closed the first clock. The second one I had known about since June, and had let myself forget, because I did not see, that fall, how it was mine to fix. The county's contract with the digitizing vendor called for the original deed and lien books. Once every page had been scanned and what the contract called verified, to be transferred to a records disposal company and destroyed. The vendor's word for it was pulped on a schedule set for the 3rd week of December. I knew that schedule because I had helped write it, back before anyone thought to ask whether the scans were accurate, before they burned the only copy that could ever prove they were wrong. I went to the December county board meeting on the 2nd Tuesday of the month in the same slacks, my legal pad in my lap, and asked to be heard during public comment, which any resident is entitled to do, and which almost nobody ever does. I laid out for the board, in order, exactly the way I would have laid out any file, 41 book and page citations that a $5 million scanning contract had gotten wrong or would have been unable to locate at all, because the original crayon annotations existed nowhere in any digital record. Only on the framing of a single house on Furnace Street that had very nearly been pulled apart for scrap in 2021. I told them a smudged 8 had already been read as a 3 on volumes going back to the 1970s, that I had flagged it in June and been told it was outside the scope of my duties, and that the same volumes were scheduled to be destroyed in 11 days.
Gary Titsworth, the board member who had championed the vendor contract 2 years earlier on the promise it would save the county $40,000 a year in storage costs,
asked me pointedly whether I had any documentation, besides my own say-so, that the scans contained errors. I told him I had 41 book and page citations that existed nowhere in the digital record at all, which was itself the documentation, and that I was glad to walk him through the 1970s volumes. Personally, on my own time, at no charge to the county, if he wanted to see the smudged 8 for himself. He did not take me up on it that night. I did not raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice at a public meeting in my life, and I did not start that night. I read the 41 citations into the record, one at a time, the way I have read 10,000 citations into that same room over 34 years, and I sat down. The board voted 6-1, 2 weeks before Christmas, to retain the original deed and lien books in county storage indefinitely, scanned copies or no scanned copies, pending a full audit of the vendor's accuracy rate. The one no vote was Titsworth's, who did not care for being told, in public, by a woman the county had let go in June, that he had been wrong about the scope of her duties. I did not take any particular pleasure in that. I want to say that plainly, too. I only wanted the books kept, and they were kept. I looked up what had become of Laverne Ostrowski, the way I look up anything through the record. He had left Furnace Street for Georgetown Manor, an assisted living facility on the east side, in November of 2019. A month after he ran that last reel in the courthouse rotunda, following what his file there listed as a fall. The reverse mortgage had come due the following year under its own permanent absence clause, the same clause I had once recorded on other people's houses without ever picturing a face behind it. He died at Georgetown Manor in April of this year, 5 months before I ever bid on his house at 89 with no listed survivors. The obituary the funeral home ran was 4 sentences long and did not mention the courthouse at all. I did not go looking for a grave to stand at. And I am not going to pretend I felt some large thing when I found his death certificate in a public database on a library computer, because that would not be honest. What I felt, mostly, was the particular quiet of a column that finally foots. 41 houses carried, one way or another. 41 releases, recorded, each one bearing a book and a page I could now cite from memory. The $71,400 from the other 40, unrecovered, and never going to be recovered, which was exactly as it should be. I paid Ivy Blakeman back $200 in December, out of the first check I earned doing what turned out to be steady work, 3 days a week at the recorder's office itself, brought back at 58 years old onto their salary schedule, because the county board that voted to keep the original books also voted, the same night, to fund one part-time position to maintain them, and nobody on that board pretended not to know who they meant to hire. I will be paying Ivy back in $200 pieces for a while yet. She has not once asked when. I still eat dinner most Thursdays at Ivy Blakeman's kitchen table. at her invitation, extended once back in November, and never formally renewed since. The way a person does not renew an arrangement both sides intend to keep. I know 4 or 5 of the other 40 families well enough now to wave at on the square. Gerald Aldridge, the man who threatened the state's attorney, sends me a Christmas card. I still do not know what became of June Restivo's house on Colfax, or her nephew in Arizona, or the one envelope that never found a living hand to receive it, and I have decided that not every thread has to be pulled all the way through before a person is allowed to call a thing finished. The kitchen floor at 118 Furnace Street passed its final inspection the last week of October, framed and sheathed and ready for a subfloor, and I have not put the finished flooring down yet because there is a plasterer coming after the new year to close the walls back up. And once the walls close, nobody will ever again get down on their knees in that kitchen and read what is written on the framing. So, on the second Sunday of December, with the house down to 40 degrees, and my breath showing in the flashlight beam, I knelt at the edge of the floor one more time, in my barn coat with the cuff still torn, and I took a blue lumber crayon I had bought for 89 cents at the hardware store on the square, and beside the last of Laverne Ostrowski's 41 entries, on a joist that still carried a stranger's Sears part number from a torn-down house outside Girard, I wrote one more line. Book 402, page 118, 2025. The book and page where 41 releases went back on the record, closed instead of collected. I left the joists open. The plasterer can close around them if he wants to, but I told him the wall over the kitchen sink stays off the schedule. Somebody, someday, is going to be down on their knees under that sink with a flashlight, the way I was. And I want the last line waiting for them when they get there.